I thought he did fine. I covered Doug as a player when he was here, so I already kind of knew him and I knew his personality a little bit. And I was kind of watching for, signs that he was sort of, putting on a show or trying to be something that he wasn't. And there was none of that. I mean, he was the same guy he was at Veterans Stadium in the locker room in 1999. That was the same guy that was at the Novigrad Complex yesterday. He's a bright guy. They brought him in here to be the starting quarterback while McNabb learned the system and the rest of the team around him learned the system. And, the bottom line was he just wasn't very good. And, he only lasted one season. Eagles released him after that year because, he kind of underperformed in what even Andy Reid, his friend, expected him to do. So, there's a guy that a little bit of humility there. He kind of failed when he was here as a player and came back as an assistant coach and was on the staff when Reid's time ran out in Philadelphia. So, all that aside, he basically, I thought the honest answers that he gave, the general sense that you were hearing really what he thought, I thought that was refreshing. I mean, with Chip Kelly, it felt like everything you heard was coming from some master's thesis that he'd written, about football years ago and was never going to budge from, what he thinks about, just the press conference he just gave, what he thinks about tempo, what he thinks about doing this and doing that. I mean, everything had a sort of slogan to it. And with Chip, that's how everything felt. With Pederson, he's just a genuine guy. And I think Jeff Lurie believes that a genuine guy is going to connect at a deeper level with his players, and that's really what the Eagles need right now. And in that sense, I thought, Pederson, again, he didn't wow anybody. I don't think anybody came away going, well, that was a great line here, or you really, said something I didn't expect over there. But it was a genuine guy, giving genuine opinions about stuff. And there was no show business involved at all. And in that sense, I thought he did well because that's who he is, and that's what we're going to get for the next few years, or however long he's the head coach.
Phil, a lot to get to from yesterday, but I think almost most important because he started out with it high at the top of his press conference was he announced Jim Schwartz will be his new coordinator. And a couple of weeks ago, one of your colleagues from ESPN, Adam Kaplan, was on the show, and he remarked about how in 1999, Andy Reid dominated the room. He was such a presence in that interview, but he didn't have a lot of experience. But he really sold Jeff Lurie and Joe Banner on his assistants. And I think you wrote about this the other day, and I was talking about it on my show. It almost seems like Schwartz is Pederson's version of Johnson, where Pederson isn't the star, but his coordinators are going to be high profile, and that really could be what sold him as the guy.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of what went on here. I mean, it's represented by Bob Lamont, who was Andy's agent as well. And Lamont is not just a guy that does contracts for his clients. He's got sort of a program that he gets his guys to buy into. And when you heard about Andy Reid getting hired and him having this huge thick notebook with everything in it that he wanted to do, he had pages of and he had a list of 5 guys he wanted to hire at each position on his staff, from 1 to 5. And who they were and what their background was. And there was this huge detailed, package that Andy Reid brought with him. And he sat down in a room with Jeff Lurie and Joe Banner back then and sold them on it. Well, that's all how Bob Lamont's clients do things. And Lamont, his first real client was Mike Holmgren. It all kind of comes from Mike Holmgren's coaching tree. John Gruden's in there, of course, and a bunch of other guys as well. But anyway, the point being that, this agent, and this is how he does things, and, Doug Pederson is borrowing from that playbook. He's going to have a similar approach to all this. And, I talked to Lamont last week, and, he kind of said that he didn't know exactly who Doug was going to go for in terms of the coordinators, but that, a Jim Johnson type of guy would be in line, the guy that could really run the defense and not need to be, overseen. Peterson's going to have a full enough job being the head coach, running the offense, doing all the things that you got to do in that part of it. He's not going to want to micromanage the defense or have to oversee a guy who's learning how to run a defense. And Jim Schwartz has got a guy that's been a head coach. He's been a coordinator. He's been in several NFL cities already. And Schwartz basically said yesterday, he's at a point in his career where he just wants to win a Super Bowl. And he doesn't care what, whether he's the head coach or the defensive coordinator. He wants to put his hands on the Super Bowl trophy as a winner. And that sounds pretty good to Philadelphia, I think. A guy that wants to come in here and run a tough, aggressive defense and win a Super Bowl. I mean, that's what the Eagles have been looking to do since Buddy Ryan got here in 1986. That was the whole point of him. And, of course, he was not able to get it done. Jim Johnson was here. That was the best run of Eagles football, pretty much ever in their history. The years that Jim Johnson was running Andy Reid's defense for him. 5 NFC championship games, Super Bowl appearance. They came pretty close but didn't get there. So that formula can work. Whether they're the right guys for the job to make that formula happen, that's what we're going to find out.
Yeah, and I guess while we're on coordinators, he also just announced, I guess, according to some reports, that it's going to be Frank Reich. You mentioned that Pederson's going to call his own plays, but I guess it's interesting because, I think Reich might have been made a little bit of a scapegoat in San Diego, but even though they did not have a great offense running the ball this year, they did throw the ball pretty well. The last couple of years, they've had some pretty decent offenses. And meanwhile, Pederson and that offense ran the ball very well, and then they bring John DeFilippo in as the quarterback coach. It seems like they are really trying to sell Sam Bradford that, hey, we've got a lot of people that work with quarterbacks here, so please consider us.
Yeah, that does seem to be kind of in the air here. A few people listened to the press conference yesterday and seemed to feel like Pederson, said nice things about Bradford, but didn't really seem like he was committed to Bradford. When I listened to it, in real time as he was saying it, I kind of thought he was, speaking pretty highly of Bradford, and it sounded like, to me, that was the plan, was to have Bradford here if possible. So
I'll tell you, Phil, there were times when it almost sounded like he was talking as if he was planning on having them. Like, hey, some of the things we're going to do, you just pop him. And it almost sounded like in his heart of hearts, he was talking as if this is the guy who we want to be the quarterback, and he's going to be here.
Yeah, that's how it seemed to me, too. So, I was a little surprised afterward to see on Twitter and some of the things I read that people kind of thought he was, underwhelming in his Sam. But he doesn't know for sure until it's all, the contract stuff is all worked out. So, I mean, it's still something he's got to, talk about in certain terms because he doesn't want to overdo it. And obviously, they don't want to drive up his value even more because, the head coach says, yeah, I can't have Sam Bradford or I wouldn't be here. That gives Sam Bradford a lot more leverage. But, to me, it sounds like, and remember, as a rookie in 2010 in St. Louis, Pat Shurmur was the offensive coordinator for the Rams when Bradford got to the NFL. First offense he learned is very, very similar to what he's would be learning here with Doug Pederson, whether Shurmur's here or not. Shurmur kind of helped coordinate the passing game under Kelly. Was in charge of some of the aspects, and partly with helping Bradford get comfortable. One thing that really struck me about listening to Bradford talk at the end of the season was he felt like mid-season or so they really kind of figured out a couple of things he was really comfortable with and the parts of the offense that really he excelled in and he was able to get the most out of. And it took them half a season to get to that point. And after that point is when his numbers went way up. I mean, his performance was really very good. And except for the injury where he, injured his shoulder and got a concussion on one play in that game, the one game at the start of the losing streak, he basically played really well down the stretch. And, that was with Shurmur having more influence in the offense. So, if it's a similar system and he's comfortable in it and Pederson's able to get things going in a way that, gets the most out of Sam Bradford, it could be a pretty good marriage. Now, Bradford, if he didn't like Philadelphia that much, which we've heard reports about, or he just wants to get the most money he can possibly get, and somebody else like Houston or somebody really wows him with an offer, I mean, there's a chance he could leave. But he's also he's been around now. He's been through a bunch of coordinators in St. Louis. He's been and he's now in a second city, going to a third city and another whole offense, another whole system. I mean, I got to think Bradford, if they make the right appeal to him, and it seems like they're starting to put the pieces together, it's got to seem a little more attractive to him than starting all over again somewhere else.
Yeah, and obviously there's a report out there that he was asking for, or his agent asked for $25 million at the start of last year. How does that factor into the Eagles' thought process on moving forward with Bradford?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's in the mix. But Tom Condon, his agent, Tom Condon is a very experienced and very competent agent. I mean, if that was the number he went into the negotiations with and opened with, that's roughly the number the franchise tag would be. It's a little high for that, but basically you take what's the highest possible number that anybody's getting, and you start from there, and then you do. That's what negotiation is. You come down, the Eagles will come up, and you find a middle ground. If he starts out at $20 million, the Eagles might go, get him down to 17 or 18 million. If he starts at 25, maybe he gets 20. So, that's what agents do. I don't read too much into that. I mean, I think Jim Trotter's report is probably accurate. That's probably where the agent started the negotiation, but it doesn't mean that's where he expected to finish the negotiation. Where you end the negotiation and how much the guaranteed money is involved, what's up front, all the stuff that kind of makes NFL contracts, kind of makes them real or not real. I mean, so many of the numbers reported in NFL contracts are just made-up numbers tacked on at the end to kind of make the deal seem bigger. So, I got a $100 million contract. So when he's trying to recruit new clients, he can point to that contract and say, hey, this is what it's all about, and this is what I can do. The real numbers are always a little bit different and lower. So that number, it's probably accurate, but it probably doesn't mean that much. The reality is, though, he's going to get somewhere in the $18 to $20 million range per year on a long-term contract. I mean, that's what quarterbacks get in the NFL now. Colin Kaepernick got a huge deal, structured in a way that they can get out of it if they have to in San Francisco. But I mean, the numbers are always in this range now. So if the franchise number is going to be close to 20, 25 million in that range, I mean, that's where you got to start if you're an agent. I mean, I don't know why you would start anywhere lower.
We're talking with Phil Sheridan, ESPN.com's NFL Nation. Jeff Lurie yesterday spoke as well. He said it was a very in-depth, terrific process that got them to Pederson. It started with 25 coaches, dwindled down to 10 or 11, included some college coaches. But many people, Phil, wonder if Pederson really was the guy. And he was asked about that. He said, I don't care. I'm the guy here. And then Lurie, kind of came in and said, no matter what anybody reported or said, there was no other offers out there on the table. But McAdoo was supposed to come in for a second interview. There were some reports that Gaze was. Do you believe that Pederson, in the end, was their number one guy?
Well, I know he was on if he was not the number one guy, he was in the top two or three guys. But, when he went into the whole process, I think the thing about it is they knew Pederson the best, except for maybe Shermer, obviously. But of the outside candidates, they knew Doug better than they knew Ben McAdoo or Adam Gase or even Coughlin. I mean, they've obviously dealt with Coughlin over the years, and he's a familiar guy around the NFL. But actually sitting in a room talking about strategy, football, how you want to do things, they had a better feeling for Pederson in general than any of those other guys. So I think it would have taken a second interview for them to feel comfortable actually offering the job to Ben McAdoo or to Adam Gase because they just didn't know him as well. And when they hired Andy in 1999, he came in for a very long interview, and they flew him back in for a second interview. But the second interview, at the end of it, he had the job. I mean, it was they call it a second interview, but it was really coming on in, and we'll talk again. And by the end of it, he had the job. He had a contract. So, my guess is that they knew Pederson. They didn't need to bring him in for a second interview for that part of the process. The other guys would have required that. They were trying to get McAdoo in here to talk to him, and that basically just triggered the Giants offering him their job. So I don't think Adam Gase was quite as high on their list as it was assumed. He went to Miami and never left. I think if the Eagles' interest had been that high, that might have played out a little longer. I don't think he would have just taken the Dolphins job without, at least coming back around to the Eagles and getting a sense of what was going on here. So my guess is that Pederson was, like, we know that if everything else goes, however it goes, Pederson will be, we're happy to hire Doug Pederson. Meanwhile, we'll talk to these other guys, get a feel for it, and if somebody blows us away and really looks, they can be, a more impressive candidate than Doug Pederson, then we'll consider them. But ultimately, I think they're perfectly happy with Doug.
Yeah, I think so too. And because I guess it's a comfortable feeling. It's back down that Andy Reid road, but he said this isn't an Andy Reid team. This is not a Doug Pederson team. This is a Philadelphia Eagles team. But, Phil, is this Philadelphia Eagles team being run by Howie Roseman?
Yeah, to some degree, I think it is. Lurie was kind of cagey about that yesterday, and kind of kept saying, we can't really answer questions about that until we hire a personnel person, and that person is in place, and then we can answer questions about structure and who does what and who reports to whom and all that stuff. So, but right now, yeah, until that's settled, if they hire somebody, I'll just throw out a name like Bill Polian because it's a familiar name, somebody who's been a GM, has done it. If they can get somebody like that, then, Rosen would likely report to that person, I would think. But if they get anybody who's like a younger, up-and-coming personnel person that they can kind of bring in as the director of personnel, that person will report to Roseman. And it seems to me that Roseman is going to be, perfectly comfortable, being the guy again. He wants to do that. He did it before. And, the thing about Roseman, it's easy to kind of like knock him down. His record as GM with the Eagles was kind of mixed. You could point to Danny Watkins and Marcus Smith, some of the first-round picks that weren't so great. But he also was the guy that drafted Fletcher Cox and Michael Kendricks, some of the guys that turned out pretty good. So, he had a mixed record, not a great record, but, not as bad as it's sometimes portrayed. But the other thing is he probably was qualified when he got the job. The Eagles, put too much faith in themselves because they kind of invented Howie Roseman. So Lurie had a guy that, they brought in, hired, groomed, kind of promoted up along the way, probably over-promoted him, made him the GM before he was ready. But now, after being the GM for a few years, kind of getting knocked back here with the whole Chip Kelly thing and having spent a year kind of looking at it from, a step removed from the process, he may now actually be qualified to be a GM. I don't know if he's going to be a great one, but he's a lot more qualified and a lot more ready for this job if that's how it falls than he was the first time around. So, while I'm not hanging, curtains in the window and celebrating, Howie Roseman's the GM, I am willing to say, look, he wasn't ready the first time, made mistakes along the way, and now after all this, he probably is at least qualified to do this. So it gives him a chance at least because that job is really important in this whole thing. Pederson is not here to be the guy who's going to build the roster. He's here to coach it. And building the roster and getting that right is going to be really important. And if Roseman isn't up to it, then Doug Pederson is going to fail.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens moving forward with Roseman and this whole personnel search now, which I guess is the next step for the Philadelphia Eagles. We're talking with Phil Sheridan, ESPN.com, NFL Nation. And, the Schwartz stuff's interesting because I would assume that would be a return to what we saw a couple of years ago with the Y9, but more so, forget the Y9, a 4-3. And do you think that the Eagles' current personnel is a better fit for a 4-3 look?
I think they kind of got to the point where they were at least ready to run a 3-4. I mean, they have personnel now that could do it. But most of that personnel, or at least a lot of it, was here for the 4-3 they ran prior to Kelly coming along. So Connor Barwin, talking to him after the season ended, he said he could add a little weight, play defensive end in a 4-3. He could still be an outside linebacker if they prefer that. But, I think if you take Vinny Curry, for example, and possibly Barwin, you had a couple of guys that could be defensive ends. Brandon Graham could put the weight back on and be a defensive end. So, Benny Logan, Bo Allen, guys like that. You have a couple guys who play tackle. I think they'll be fine at a 4-3. And the way the linebacking thing shook out last year, they thought inside linebacker was going to be one of their great strengths on the team. Ended up being a kind of disaster area with guys either getting hurt or just not playing very well, or guys getting over injuries, not playing up to their old standards, like Kiko Alonso and D'Amico Ryans. Even Kendricks has not really played himself half the season. With that group of guys, you can move all those guys around. Jordan Hicks, the rookie, said he played all three linebacker spots in a 4-3 in college. So, you have enough linebackers that you could play, moving those guys around and which side they play, or, who's in the middle and who's going to be a weak side, who's going to be strong side. You can figure that out. But the thing I liked about Schwartz and talking to him, he wants to get these guys out in the field, take a look at what everybody does and how they do it, and figure out how to scheme them based on what he's got in terms of his players. He's not married to any of those, whether it's a 4-3 or he said basically, everybody in the NFL uses a wide 9 formation at times.
Mm-hmm.
You're in a pass rush situation, I mean, the problem they had when they had Jim Washburn here was he basically wanted to run, that wide 9 formation on every down. And because he wanted that from his defensive line, they kind of forced Juan Castillo, the coordinator, to accommodate that because they had hired Washburn and promised that he could run his wide 9, and everything kind of fell apart for them. That's not how you basically plan a football team and run a football team. That's really the backward way of doing it. The way Schwartz is talking about makes sense. See what we got. We'll line them up the best way we can, and we're going to be aggressive and attack defense, and that's what we're going to run. And that's he's going to use the personnel the best way he can. He talked about guys he had in Tennessee, Detroit, and Buffalo, and how different guys have kind of dictated different defensive alignments and formations. That all sounded like a guy who really knows what he's doing. He was pretty impressive. I'll be honest with it. Talking to him, Jim Johnson was a little older when they hired him. He was a guy that had been around longer. But had that same kind of sense of, you just got a sense from the guy. He really knew what he was talking about. He really understood football, and he was ready to go and make the most of it. So that part is a good hire, it seems like. I think he has a chance to run a really good defense, which in Philadelphia, we'll earn you a lot of points every time.
Yeah, and Jim Schwartz, defensive coordinator. It will be Frank Reich, the offensive coordinator, and, of course, the new head coach, Doug Pederson. Phil Sheridan, ESPN.com's NFL Nation, at Sheridan Scribe. Kind enough to share some time with yesterday's press conference in the books. Plenty more coming up on the show. Thanks, Phil.
Yep, thanks, Mike.